Hi, everybody. Welcome to Let's Talk TEFL. I'm Jackie, and joining me is Jennifer. Hey, Jennifer.
Hi, Jackie.
So today's episode, we're talking about how to make ESL classrooms or EFL or whatever term you like to use, how to make them more student-centered. So first of all, I'll just start off by talking a little bit about teacher-centered versus student-centered. So a teacher-centered classroom is kind of like their traditional thing that you might imagine. The teacher standing at the front, maybe as a PowerPoint presentation, is giving a little bit of a lecture, and the students are just listening, taking notes. The students are a little bit passive in that. So that would be kind of the model for many university lecturers. They would just give the information and students would take in the information. Versus student-centered. So student-centered classroom, students are way more active and they are talking to each other instead of the teacher just talking to the students. So the students are active, maybe working in groups, doing something, talking with a partner. They're maybe doing some kind of writing. So students are, just way more active than in a traditional teacher-centered classroom. Is that a good overview, Jennifer? Is there anything you would
Yeah,
add
yeah.
to that?
And I think in this modern era, obviously teacher-centered has fallen out of favor, but also it seems like it wouldn't even be necessary to have a synchronous lesson, much less actually attend live in person,
Mm-hmm.
because you could just download the audio or watch a video at your leisure. Yeah. And the students are passive. They're just sort of letting the information flow over them. I
Mm-hmm.
remember as a student myself, like my most hated classes were the ones where it seemed like the lecturer literally was like, "Oh, I've got a class to teach. What what page are we on?" And then they would
Oh,
literally just open the book and read,
oh,
because this was
that
like
was
the
so
age
bad.
before PowerPoint. Like there is a professor that I still remember to this day. Do not remember her name, but she read to us every class
Oh.
for the entire semester.
But people can read like at a speed, I don't know, 3 or 4 times faster. Generally, most people
Yes.
can, or even 5 times. Like I'm a quick reader. I can probably read 5 or 6 times faster than somebody can just like talk.
Well, and
So for me, when
also,
someone does that, I want to die. Like, and I
yes,
have the textbook at my house. I can just read it.
yes, yes. Like
Ugh,
attendance was mandatory. And
ugh,
if you didn't attend three classes over the course of the semester, the professors could drop you without telling you.
oh, wow.
And so, like, you couldn't just skip. I literally had to go. It was an 8 a.m. class, and I had to go at 8 o'clock in the morning and be read to. And
Oh man.
it sucked my will to live so hard.
Yes,
But here we
exactly.
are. This is like 30 years later, and I
You still
still
remember.
remember how bad it was.
Okay, well, our next point is why does this matter? And I think that was actually just a really good demonstration of why it
Yes.
matters. Teacher-centered classrooms, I think just in all the research I've seen, and I think most educators would generally agree, it's not that effective. Students don't generally retain a lot of information. And this is especially true for a language, learning a language.
Yeah.
To really like take it in and to master it, you have to practice like a ton, way
Yeah.
more practice than even our students get in our classrooms. They have to take what they learn in our classroom and practice in our classroom and take it outside to the real world if it really wants to stick and or if they really want it to stick. And so for language learning, for sure, the more active the students are, the better they will retain the information. And ultimately, that's what the most important thing is in our classes. Whatever we teach, we want students to take with them just beyond the test and beyond whatever little class that we're teaching them in their whole journey of language learning.
Yeah. And not to mention also, if the students are just sitting there passively, it's so easy to tune out someone who's speaking another language.
Mm-hmm. Oh
I
yeah,
think,
in a first language is easy to tune someone out, but
yes. Like
second language.
I think if you're having a teacher-centered foreign language class, I think you would have the entire class daydreaming in about a minute.
I would give
Yeah.
it like 10 seconds. All right. So, Jennifer, let's get into some tips for making classrooms more student centered. So, the first tip that I have is working in groups or pairs instead of, so generally I would put students into small groups of 3 or 4 or pairs. I generally prefer pairs. Just because it increases student talking time. So if you put students into groups of 4 in a class of 20, that means how many people? 5 people are maybe talking at the same time. Where if you put students into pairs, that's 10 people that are talking and then 10 people that are listening, and nobody is passive in that. So, yeah, think groups or pairs instead of teacher and students. So, I
Yeah.
generally will avoid the like interaction with the teacher with the class, unless I have a class of say like 3 or 4 students, then it just makes sense to have a class discussion way more often. But
Yeah.
anything beyond say like 4 students, I'll put students into pairs and then have them talk to each other, and then I'll just do like a little kind of rounding off thing. I would elicit an answer or just kind of get a little bit of feedback at the end of each activity, but that would take like 30 seconds or a minute
Yeah.
generally to do that.
And I like to move between, like, I like to do a think, pair, share. So individual and then pair work and then group work. And I also like to move between different size groupings, so
Mm-hmm.
usually like if I had students sitting at a table, talk to the person next to you and then the whole table all talk together.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of breaks stuff up so they feel like they're doing something different, even though they're still really doing the same activity.
Mm.
And that's just another way to keep things a little bit more interesting.
For sure. For sure. All right. So the next one I have is test, teach, test versus PPP, which is presentation, practice, production. There's kind of a few different ways to say that, but we'll just say PPP for presentation, practice, production. So I did the CELTA course in Seoul. And I always thought my classrooms were very student centered, and I didn't actually talk that much as a teacher. But one of my tutors was like, you could actually make it more student centered. And at the time, I was kind of like a little bit defensive. And I was like, what? Like, I don't know about that. Like, it's already,
Impossible.
what are you talking about? Anyway, so he suggested, okay, for the next lesson, why don't you try the test, teach, test approach? Because, and then just get rid of the presentation part of the lesson. So I was like, okay, I'll give it a try. So test, teach, test is like, ideal if you think students have already covered that certain aspect of grammar or vocabulary a few times. Like, for example, if the unit is on weather or hobbies, almost all students, except absolute beginners, would already know a good bit of information and vocabulary about that. So you can give them a little test at the beginning of a class, and then it's a nice way to uncover what students know and what students don't know. And then you can have a little short teaching session based on what students don't know, like maybe the vocabulary words. They're like, what is thunderstorm, or like, what is blizzard, or whatever. So just kind of quickly go over those. And then you can have another test session at the end. So it doesn't have to be like a formal written test, but it can be an activity where
Right.
students
Yeah.
would be expected to incorporate those new things into the lesson. Yeah, so it actually went really well. And I took that with me into my classes, not all the time, but I would mix it up. I would do that once in a while if I was like, students already like know the simple past quite well. So I would give them a little test. And then maybe, for example, they had a difficult time with like making the negative form. Like, I didn't go to school
Yeah.
yesterday because I was sick. They would say I didn't went to school because I was sick or whatever. So I would do like a very quick review about something like that. And then we would move on with the lesson, and well, not move on, but we would incorporate that into
Yeah.
activities into the
Yeah.
lesson. So,
And I think if anybody is unfamiliar with TTT as a lesson planning format, don't think of it like a test, like a formal test. Think of it like an assessment activity. Like, do some activity that uses the target language to see how well the students already know that language. So yeah, like you said, like whether, any of the like basic 12 subjects that all of the ESL textbooks for kids, like every series would have like the same 12 topics, like
Hmm.
animals and hobbies and weather and those kind of things. Unless your students are absolute beginners, yeah, just start with a little activity, see what they already know, and then have sort of a general idea that of problems that they could have, like vocabulary that needs to be reinforced, or like you said, like using the negative correctly. um, but be ready to just base the heart of the lesson on what you see happening in real time in your class.
Mm.
So it is a little bit harder because you do have to be prepared to think on your feet and go with what is happening in your class in the moment, rather than a PPP lesson where you can sort, like, if you have 5 groups of kids with the same material, you could use that lesson 5 times. You wouldn't be able to use that teach part 5 times, or
Hmm.
rather it would be different for each of the 5 classes.
For sure. It does require, yeah, a bit of thinking on your feet, but definitely give it a try and see what you think. I really enjoyed that style of teaching, and yeah, definitely would like to do it once
Yeah.
in a while in my classes.
And I think the students respond to it better if it is a topic that they cover like every semester, because like some of the ESL textbooks, they're meant to be used for just a couple of months, and then they'll
Mm-hmm.
do another textbook and it'll have like the same 12
Oh, exactly.
basic topics, and it'll build on it slightly. I mean, I get the reasoning behind it, that it's building and cycling and taking what's been learned previously and just in tiny little increments adding to it. But students do get pretty bored with the same stuff, so if you can come in and not teach them what an elephant is for the 50th time, let them show that they know what an elephant is. They
For
like
sure.
that as well.
For sure. All right, so the next one is to try out some task-based learning activities. Um, and I'm just going to mention that I actually just wrote a book about this. It's on Amazon. You can find it. It's called 39 Task-Based Language Teaching and Learning Activities by Jackie Boland. So have a look there for some of my ideas. It's the book that I feel like I've been meaning to write for so long, and I finally did it.
Oh, that's a
And
good one.
I think it's really, yeah, there isn't any other really books for language teachers out there that have, there's some theory books about task-based
Yeah.
learning and teaching, but there isn't really a practical guide with a bunch of activities. So yeah, have a look at that. But basically, task-based learning is when students work in pairs or groups to complete a task. And kind of the hallmark of a task-based activity is that students are free to use whatever language they would like in order to complete the task or to complete the activity. It's not prescribed. So students have a greater degree of freedom to explore the language and just learn what they need to learn in order to complete that activity. And the teacher can kind of act as a guide in that process and then give some feedback at the end. But it's not like a very prescribed, like, we're going to talk about the simple past now. And then
Right.
so
Yes.
it can be more motivating. It does take a bit of work to set up these kind of style of activities. Um, but yeah, so try it out. And Jennifer, I think we should actually do a podcast episode about task-based activities,
Definitely. I
because
love task-based learning. And yeah, I'm kind of sad now that your book wasn't available back in the day,
yeah,
because yeah, there was definitely a lack of like practical activities that would have suited my teaching situation.
I actually did a bunch of research for the book. Like, of course, I have my own ideas and my own activities, but I do like to look around the internet and check on Amazon and see what other people are talking about in terms of task-based activities. And honestly, there just isn't a ton of information out there. There's a couple resources, but the best resource, the number one hit for like task-based learning was my own website, my own information. And I was like, oh, okay. I guess this is like people just aren't really like writing about that kind of stuff. So I don't know. So I'm hoping that it's really practical and useful because it's like, I feel like I didn't necessarily have a guide to like help me. I would have loved to like have seen some other interesting ideas out there. So anyway, check it out. I think you guys will find it useful if you're interested in task-based teaching for sure. Yeah. All right, Jennifer. So let's do a podcast episode about that. But the next one is offering choices. So I think that was your tip. So what do you think?
So something that I like to do. So I love a bingo board, but bingo boards don't always have to be used for games. I would do things like if I was required to have my students, for example, like write in their journal every day, rather than tell everybody like this is the topic that you have to write in your journal, or on the flip side say write whatever you want, because then the student, like a lot of students are really paralyzed by that. What I would do was would have like a bingo board, and it might have been 9 or 16 different things that they could write about, and they could, over the course, like for example, if they had to do something every week, then at the end of the month I would ask them to have one bingo, and I would sort of place things in a way that there would be one thing at least that they probably wouldn't be too excited to do, but something that would push them a little bit, so they couldn't be like, oh, I'm going to write a haiku today, and tomorrow I'm going to write about my favorite birthday present. And then, like there had to be one thing in there that I knew would be a little bit more challenging for them, but like none of them would be like, okay, write 300 words about how the economy could be improved, So I would try to have a real mix in there, but it would be sort of strategically done. So they couldn't take it all, like they couldn't just randomly pick like 4 super easy things, but they would have at least 1 or 2 easy things, no matter which way they went.
Sure. So, okay. And then the next couple tips I think are maybe a little bit similar. Problem solving activities and group projects. So these are kind of like they've kind of also fit into the task-based learning. So task-based learning, like having a problem to solve. And a group project, definitely it's better in groups to solve problems in language class. So do you have like kind of an example of
sure,
like maybe an activity?
Like, problem solving activities, like that can be so many things. It could be like a physical challenge, like a minute to win it kind of thing, where they've got like some random objects that they have to use in some way, like build a tower with straws and solo cups, or it could be something like they have a logic puzzle and they've got to go through it together and work out the clues to try to solve it faster than other teams, or even just like riddles. They can discuss it together rather than just try to think of the answer silently. Mm-hmm. You can turn a lot of things into problem solving activities. And one thing that was really popular with a lot of my students was word problems, like math word problems, because most of my students were, generally speaking, more comfortable with math than with English. And so it kind of would give the mathier kids a little moment to shine. But also, like if they just needed to learn the English math vocabulary, then like that would really sort of be all they needed, and then they could work out. And so you can do so many things under the umbrella of problem solving activities, and it's that little aspect of mystery, I guess, that makes it more exciting and more fun for them to talk about.
Yeah, one thing I used to like to do is give like a problem. Like for example, a university student is studying way too much and is exhausted, but his parents are pressuring him so much to like get a really good job and get scholarships and stuff. And then I would get students in small groups to give some advice to that student, and they would make a little presentation. So they were helping to solve that problem, and that fit really well into the unit on like shouldn't giving advice. So yeah, it
Yes.
can be like not exact like riddles or something, but it can be kind of like bigger picture, like solving
Yeah.
problems like that as well. So yeah, that was one of my favorite activities, and students really enjoyed it and kind of resonated. I would choose a good problem that students resonated with and they could identify with, and they would have lots to say about what that guy should
Yeah.
do.
Like an agony aunt activity. And that would usually tie in with like letter writing. And so they would have to like write their response to this letter written to,
Mhm.
dear Abby or whatever. And students love that, like, because everybody loves to solve somebody else's problems.
Oh
Like, that's
yeah, for
always so much
sure.
easier than solving your own.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so the next one is about feedback. So um
Yeah.
definitely, I think for feedback, it is very tempting to just correct every single mistake that you hear. And I mean, I've been there, and it's sometimes hard not to like say anything, but I would generally reserve feedback until maybe the end of an activity, and I would wait until I heard something more than once.
Yeah.
And then I would give, like two or three little feedback tips to the class. Yeah, so I think if you correct every single thing every single time, that leads to a very teacher centered
Yes. And
classroom.
it's also kind of soul destroying as a student.
Yes.
And it kind of paralyzes your students if they feel like you've got giant ears and you're going to hear every mistake and you're going to point it out in front of the whole class. No, exactly. As the students are working on something, and especially when they're in groups, they're pairs, whatever, just monitor, like mingle around, see who needs help or guidance, and do that in the moment, helping them as guiding them as much or as little as needed, keeping them on task, making sure that they're using English, making sure that they listened to the instructions and understood them properly in order to carry out the task. But at the end of it, just a couple of little things. This is something I heard as I was walking around. And yeah, you want to do something that you heard a few times and maybe change some little detail so it's not automatically apparent to the student that you're quoting.
Exactly.
Yeah, because you want to make it as low stress for the students as possible. And if you're
Mhm.
like, I heard Jackie say this, and it's so wrong.
Oh, never. I would just say, I heard somebody, I heard some people.
Yes,
For
some
sure, it's much
people.
better
You always want
language.
to make it sound like multiple people were making the same mistake.
Yeah,
And chances
exactly.
are you did hear multiple people making the same mistake.
Yes, exactly. All right, so let's quickly talk about how to make these kind of activities successful. So, if students are going to be doing a whole bunch of activities with each other, you have to choose the activities wisely. I mean, that's a little bit obvious to say that, but it's also worth noting. So it can be a little bit tricky. Sometimes I've chosen activities unwisely and it was too difficult, and students would just kind of sit
Yeah.
silently. And it wasn't their fault, it was my fault because it was too
Yeah.
difficult, or I didn't explain it well, or I didn't demonstrate the activity. So I think if in doubt, choose an easier activity and make the focus on the language, the target language, and not on like, can you understand the activity? Yes or no. The goal is that everybody in the class can understand the mechanics or kind of the logistics of that activity, but then the language is the highlight or the feature of
Yeah.
it, not understanding 12 steps in some complicated activity.
Yeah. Oh, that always felt the worst when, like, anytime, especially something I really was like, oh, this is going to be great, they're going to love this, and I would spend like way too much time preparing for something because I just was so excited about it, and then get in class and it totally bombed because it was too difficult, or it had too many steps, or just whatever. I had not properly considered the student's level. And or maybe they just needed more guidance than I had realized they would need, and for the time allotted it just wasn't a practical activity. And that is kind of just a learn by bad experience kind of
Yes.
thing.
Yes. For sure. And I would generally have a backup, kind of a couple backup activities in my head, or like a couple things at the end of my lesson plan that I would just say, like, okay, if something flops or like whatever happens, I have these activities that I won't end up doing, but I have them here. So if something really goes badly, I don't know, like I would sometimes just say, like, okay, you guys, I'm sorry. This is like not a good idea. Or like, oh, I don't think this is working. It's my fault. It's too difficult. I'm sorry. Let's move on to the next thing. So that happened quite rarely. Usually I could make it work, but don't be scared just to like say to your students, I'm sorry. This was not a good choice or like whatever, and then just move on and just start, do the next thing. And I mean, it happens. Everyone makes mistakes, teachers make mistakes in planning, and it's like a thing, and students actually were just kind of like, okay, whatever, and like didn't really care. So
Yeah, probably just relieved.
yeah, just like, oh, I don't have to do this activity that I don't understand, and the teacher's not going to be annoyed at me for not talking, but I don't know what I should talk about. And like, yeah, so they're like, they don't care, they're like relieved for sure. So yeah, don't worry about it and just move on, but have one or two kind of like backup things in your lesson.
Yeah, but that's sort
for
of
that situation.
good advice for any time. You should always have some little something in your back pocket that you can pull out that doesn't necessarily have to relate clearly to the topic at hand, but something that's like a malleable activity that you can adapt as needed.
Flexible for sure. Yeah. All right, Jennifer, is there any other kind of final things that we could talk about making ESL classrooms more student-centered?
I think just always, demonstrating for the students what you want to see, kind of, like, especially if it's some project or, something that is more open to interpretation. The more it's open to interpretation, like the more guidance I feel like you should give, unless you really want it to be 100% open-ended. And whatever they give is great. But if you have like some sort of end in mind, then don't keep it a secret. Rubrics, demonstrations, especially if it's going to be assessed. If it's going to be assessed, then you really need to have like a clear rubric for them to go by.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, 100%. I agree. If you're going to assess something, yeah, then students need to know kind of the expectations and how to get a good grade if they care about that. On that. Exactly. All right. So I think maybe that is a good place to end. So Jennifer, where can people find you online?
They can find me on my blog, teachtravelearn.com, and also my YouTube channel, Teach Travel Learn. And where can people find you?
Well, I definitely recommend checking out my book on Amazon. It's called 39 Task-Based Language Teaching and Learning Activities. And then I'll also put a link to my blog article that also has some task-based activity ideas there. And that's a really nice way to make classrooms more student-centered. And then for all the podcast episodes and all the information, you can go to eslactivity.org/podcast. All right. So I think that's it. Thanks, Jennifer.
All right. Thanks, Jackie. Talk to you next time.
Sure. Bye, everybody.
Bye.